I'll kick off because we have some housekeeping to do anyway. So hello everybody and thank you for tuning in. Welcome to this masterclass on financial services, and this is actually our first masterclass of our autumn term schedule. We've got a great panel here today, lots to get through, so really hope that you enjoyed this masterclass and get involved in the conversation. So we always start our practice area masterclasses with our learning outcomes. So just so you know, by the end of this masterclass, you should know how to break into this practice area, know what the work of a financial services solicitor involves, and know some of the key issues facing this practice area right now. Before we get going, just usually as we do to run through our house rules. So first and foremost, please do use that online question tool to try and post any questions that you have. And I will be asking them to our speakers at the end, and I'll try and see if any relevant ones come up during our conversation too. And do use this tool as well to let us know if you have any audio visual problems, and we'll do our best to help you. Please note, we always get a million questions. This masterclass is being recorded, and the recording of this session will be sent in a follow-up email tomorrow, and it will shortly be available on our YouTube channel as well. You can post about this masterclass on social media using hashtag LCM Masterclass. And as I mentioned earlier, we have so many fantastic masterclasses coming up over the autumn term. So do check out the Law CareersNet events page for all the masterclasses that we are running. Our next one is next Wednesday. That's called Starting Out in Law. That's going to cover the sort of very basics of entering the legal profession. If you're interested in that, please sign up. Or our next practice area masterclass is on the 19th of September, and that's looking at the work of IP lawyers. We'd love to see you at any and all of our events this term. So just going to start with our usual poll, which is, could you please answer and let us know what stage you are at? And then I can share this with our panelists so we can see who is here with us today. Great, let me just share those results. So a huge chunk of second, third year law students, which is great. A few non-law, a few postgrad, a few first year law, and quite a few as well graduated and in work. Thank you very much. And if I just go back and share finally our second poll, which is how much do you know about this area, financial services? We're assuming not many of you are going to say that you're an expert, but it'd just be good to know whereabouts you are so our panel can know too. And it's also fine to say absolutely nothing because that's obviously what we're here for today as well. Okay, let me share those results. Well, nobody is an expert apart from our expert panelists. And that's great. So very honest people saying they know absolutely nothing, 17%, thank you for that. And the majority of you a little, and a very small majority a lot. So that's really great. And hopefully today we can illuminate you about this area, and you'll be sort of coming away with a lot. And we'll check at the end your key takeaway and sort of how much you've learned. So I think we're ready to start our conversation with our panelists. So I'm firstly going to go around and ask them to introduce themselves and say a little about their work. I'm going to go by order of my screen. So Rachel, you are top. So if you would like to go first, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Preston. I'm a senior associate at McFarland's in the financial services team. I have a very broad regulatory practice. It largely focuses in the retail sector, but I advise lots of different types of clients like banks, asset managers, wealth managers, mortgage providers, and other types of regulated firms on all aspects of financial regulation.
Thank you. And Oksana is next for me.
Apologies, I thought that would happen. Hello, I'm Oksana Hudson, and I am a senior associate at TLT in Manchester. I deal with a mix of contentious and non-contentious work, including banking litigation such as mortgage mis-selling and consumer credit disputes, professional negligence claim, and mortgage possession claims, and also whistleblowing investigations in the financial sector.
Thank you. And Saskia?
Hi everyone, I'm Saskia Roberts. I'm a second year associate at Jones Day. I focus mostly on real estate finance with a little bit of leverage finance, working with banks, investment banks, asset managers on real estate financing.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Samuel.
Hello everyone, I'm a partner in the Trevor Smith financial services and markets team. I'm one of 7 partners in the team, and we've got about 30 or so other lawyers. I started my career at Freshfield. I was a trainee and associate there before moving to Trevor Smith in 2017. And at one stage in my career, I did a secondment at Goldman Sachs, which was really interesting. In terms of the sort of client work, I suppose just conscious of that poll, I think to simplify it considerably, the sort of areas I see really are advising, as in the areas that you could cover in this sort of field are advising banks, in particular retail banks or investment banks. They're very different propositions, insurance, asset and wealth management, and then financial market infrastructure, which is the sort of plumbing that makes share trading, payments, all that sort of thing, makes the city go round essentially. And we cover all of those really, apart from insurance, which is a slightly specialist thing in itself. And I in particular do quite a lot on the asset and wealth management side.
Great, thank you. And Samuel, sticking with you, I've given you the sort of difficult task of trying to summarize the sort of types of lawyers in this area, for example, contentious or non-contentious, and perhaps also summarizing the sort of distinct different parts of this practice area, if you're able to, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've given the sort of the very broad different client types. Within that, any of those client types can have a need for contentious or non-contentious advice, depending on what they're up to, what sort of scrapes they might be getting into. Contentious really means something has gone a little bit wrong, to put it really simply, litigation and investigations. And so that in some firms is part of a litigation team rather than a financial services team. That's how it was at Freshfields, for example. Meanwhile, non-contentious means advisory principally. So clients are coming to you not because something's necessarily gone wrong, but because there are some new rules coming into force, as there always are. They need some help with those, or they're doing a reorganization, for example, and so they're fine to go ahead, but they need to make sure that they get the regulatory side of things right, or just queries. There's a huge amount of regulation out there, and just business as usual generates regulatory queries. I mean, in terms of my team, it's not strictly contentious or non-contentious, although it's the majority of the work tends to be non-contentious. But that said, over the last year, we've had 3 big contentious matters. There was a big market abuse investigation we did. There was a conduct investigation. We might talk about this later, but essentially, these days, the way individuals act in regulated firms is something the FCA is more and more focused on. And so essentially, if you have someone senior misbehaving, that can generate all sorts of employment law consequences, but also increasingly regulatory ones. And then the other one, and I'll definitely talk about this later, was debanking, which is a word which didn't really exist just over a year ago, I think, but the whole Nigel Farage saga, the attempted closure of his Coots bank account, was something that I and several other people in the firm were very busy on a few months ago. Personally, I think that contentious work is great. There's always that sort of excitement about it because something has gone wrong, but the sort of downside sometimes can be quite protracted. Some of these matters are great, others just go on for years and years as types of litigation can do, whereas the advisory tends to be a more regular stream of work. Sometimes you have projects on, but typically you have a whole range of things rather than just 1 or 2 big investigations, which is what you might have if you were really focusing on the contentious side.
Great, thank you. That was a fantastic summary, and I'm sure we're going to go into a lot more of that in detail later. And we are, spoiler alert, going to try and get you all to give a quick case study as well later, so maybe you might cover some of that. Oksana, over to you. I wonder if you could sort of let us know how specialist this area is. So do you only do this sort of work, or might you be sort of dabbling in other practice areas, other types of law?
Well, it's a diverse role, offering a real variety. Each case is unique, and 2 days are rarely alike. So at TLT, we deal with a real mix of different work. So we defend reputationally sensitive claims, and we undertake specialist projects for our clients to help them prevent claims against them in the future. We also deal with banking litigation claims such as mis-selling and consumer credit disputes. We deal with cyber disputes, secure litigation such as mortgage possession claim, fraud and financial crime, professional negligence claim. So anything where the bank needs or financial lender needs our assistance in terms of something that's gone wrong, or they need some advice in respect of something that may happen in the future.
And just sticking with you, Oksana, because I think I want to ask everyone, I think some of you might have already covered this, but it'd be helpful if you could sort of say the sorts of clients that you work for, and perhaps in what sectors or sorts of clients, that you work for. That would be great.
Well, we have a strong and diverse client base, and that includes the UK's major clearing banks, building societies, private and wealth banks, digital banks, international banks, payment service providers, and also fixed charge receivers. So a real mix.
Yeah, real mix.
Yeah.
Rachel, anything to add on the types of clients that you work with?
I think I work for a similar profile of clients to as everybody else. The only other thing that I would add is sometimes I get interesting clients that aren't in the regulated space. So I've worked for football clubs before, well-known sports brands who don't do financial services as their main business, but they may do it. They may offer things like gift cards or tokens on their products. So sometimes we get really interesting and obscure clients, which keeps things fun.
Does that feel quite different to work for sort of really different clients like that? Is it quite refreshing?
Yeah, it is. And they know different things, and they're driven by, lots of our institutional clients like retail banks will, the lawyers in those teams will know precisely what we're talking about. And their drivers will be very different from, for example, a sports brand who are just interested in getting a deal over the line and they don't know much about the, financial services space. So you really have to tailor your approach depending on the client.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe you can come back to that later, but I like that idea of, being able to break things down as well for your clients who might not understand sort of the jargon or the technicalities as well as others. Saskia, I wondered if you could let us know a bit about your clients, and I think the next question is yours as well, and maybe you can lead into that about the sorts of problems that you help them with.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that would also depend on the kind of client, similar to what Rachel was saying. If you have a client who's a big bank, big investment bank, they'll often have done these kind of financings before, or will want a very creative solution to a problem. Whereas you might have a client who hasn't done it before, who will need a bit more walking through. So it's tailored. The kind of problems you're helping with will be tailored based on the client that you're working with. But on the real estate finance side, we help either lenders or borrowers very simply in terms of lending a large amount of money to finance, could be a property, could be anything, or borrowers, and dealing with refinancing a loan or releasing a loan, or if something's gone wrong and it's not got contentious yet, potentially restructuring a loan. So again, that can be quite a creative solution if you've got a bank which isn't as regulated that can do these things, or if you're advising a regulated bank, that's also very different. And you'd be looking at the type of thing that you're financing, the type of asset that you're doing, and how the loan would sort of deal with that. So there's loads of problems that you're helping with at the outset, and then as the deal goes on, and that's why every deal is different, because as the deal goes on, there are new problems that come up, and that's why it can be very interesting when you're working with these kind of clients, because most of the time it's different every single time.
Yes, thank you. I feel like whenever we do any sort of talks with lawyers, that kind of like every day is different, and a real diversity of days and work and problems. And that kind of leads me into the next question, Rachel, which was that, is there a steady workflow, or is it just sort of peaks and troughs? It just depends on what you're working with and time of year, that sort of thing.
There is always a steady flow of work, definitely. And it goes to a point that Samuel was making earlier, that you have your what we would call business as usual work, the nice advisory pieces. And then on top of that, you may in a given week get thrown a bit of a curveball because a client's done something that's piqued the interests of the FCA, which is the body that regulates financial services firms in the UK. around about this time of year, we generally see an uptick in corporate M&A activity in my team. So that's where, very simply, for example, a client is looking to buy a financial services firm, or our client is the firm that is being acquired. And when you have that type of work, the timetable is typically dictated by the corporate team, and you are in more of a support role. So that can also have an impact on your normal workflow, and whether you have longer hours for a couple of weeks, or, it just depends on the diet of work that you have at the time.
That's great. Does anybody else have anything to say about type of work, or does everybody agree sort of with what Rachel was saying? Yeah, nods. Well, we've already had a question come in that matches my next question, so that's great. So Samuel, this one's for you, and that's a kind of run through, if you can. We've just said there isn't really such thing as a typical day, but what might a typical day look like for you? And the question I've just received is, what are the most common tasks you do? So I think that would be a good summary, if possible, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, I just looking at my diary, preparing for this, and so this is real, very much a real response. I mean, just this week, for example, I've got a conference on AI and financial services, which is one of their hot topics at the moment. Obviously, a hot topic in the world, and therefore it's a hot topic in financial services. This morning, I had an internal planning meeting to work out what we're going to say to a bank, to a very big bank, which does a lot of lending to what are called pay tech businesses, i.e. firms which, a little bit like Rachel was saying, they don't think of themselves first and foremost as financial services firms. They think of themselves as tech firms. But unfortunately, if you start straying into payments activities, you start acting as the person in the middle between payors and payees, for example. Then you can find yourself needing a license, and so the bank gets some training from us so that they can see that when they are putting together a lending deal, they can make sure they're doing the right sort of due diligence on the borrower to make sure that it's got a license from the FCA if it needs one, and if it has got a license, make sure it's got the right sort of license. Then this morning I was also reviewing some draft advice on regulatory capital, which is a very very abstruse subject. We definitely won't get into that in too much detail, but in essence, you have to have enough cash and capital on your balance sheet if you're a regulated firm, so that you can withstand a crisis like the financial crisis. That's where a lot of this came from. The financial crisis of 2008 to 2009, a long time ago now, but a lot of the rules date from that era. And then lastly, this afternoon, tomorrow morning, I've got a couple of calls with alternative asset managers on ESG. Now, two specific terms within that. Alternative asset managers are asset managers in the sense that they raise funds, i.e. they gather money from a range of sources and then they invest it. An alternative asset manager means someone who doesn't raise funds from the likes of the people on this call, from the likes of us, retail, but rather from pension funds and insurers, organizations which have a lot of money and which need to invest it in order to pay people's pensions, or to be able to afford to pay out if there's or as and when there are claims on people's insurance policies. And so alternative asset managers, they take that and they take that sort of institutional money and then they invest it in a whole range of assets, but those can include private equity, so private companies rather than listed shares, or real estate, the sort of thing Saskia was touching on, or credit, i.e. they can actually act like a bank and lend. So that's what they do. And another hot topic recently over the last few years has been ESG regulation, environmental, social, and governance regulation. And the sort of philosophy behind this new area of regulation is that if we're to do something about rising temperatures, then the way in which these huge asset managers deploy their capital is important. If we try and steer them in some sense towards greener rather than browner investments, then that's the sort of thing that could make a difference. So there's been a been a slew, really. In fact, it's continuing of this sort of ESG regulation, and so clients need quite a lot of help navigating those. What do they say? Greenwashing has been a topic, so they want to promise a certain amount of green investment because it goes down well with investors, but not too much, otherwise they risk greenwashing. So that's, well, I suppose that's sort of 3 days maybe. I've said there rather than one, but that just illustrates the sort of variety. And I suppose the kind of things that I do, well, I'm a partner, which essentially means that in some ways I'm a bit of a jack of all trades. I've discovered really over the last year or so, because all of those things, going to conferences, reviewing advice, setting up to calls, managing people, those are all quite different skills. And within any day, certainly in any week, I'm doing the whole range of those things. So it's not just not just reading the law and applying it. It's quite a varied sort of role.
Thank you. We love it when people actually look in their diaries when we ask them what they're doing and provide real life examples, because I think that's really fantastic insight for our audience. I've actually just got a follow-up question for Rachel that's come in that I feel like would be good timing to ask, because you mentioned when we were talking about the sort of peaks and troughs, and you said, this time of year there is an uptick in M&A and activity, and Samuel has just asked, well, what drives that?
Lots of things can drive it, but at the moment, I think what's driving M&A activity now is the fact that there's a little bit more certainty in the market around interest rates, which drive the cost of borrowing, for example. And when there is more certainty in the market around that, it makes it easier to finance transactions, to value companies that you're looking to buy. So when the market's a bit steadier, there tends to be a bit of an uptick in M&A activity. But there's always opportunities for corporate transactions, whatever the market is like.
Thank you. Saskia, I wonder if you could sort of summarize the international elements of this practice area. How international is your work, for example?
Yeah, my work's very international. There's not many deals where we just have a UK element to it. So that will depend on the type of transaction that you're working on, but depending where the borrower is incorporated, where your client's incorporated, what the business is if it's a business or asset that they're acquiring, where that is, will all impact whether you're just working out of the UK or dealing with other jurisdictions as well, which can be really interesting. A lot of the time it will be English law based in terms of the governments which are governing it, and that's why we're involved. But then you'll have others. So often we're working with the Dutch office or Luxembourg office or offices in the US. A lot of the time in Europe, there's been a lot more of an uptake on those kind of assets recently. So it's very international, and it's quite interesting to see how different the law is in different places. Sometimes it's a lot more borrower-friendly jurisdictions or lender-friendly jurisdictions. All have very different ways of dealing with if stuff goes wrong when you're restructuring, how easy it is for somebody to come in and take assets or take security or deal with the structure that you've put in place. So it can be very insightful, and you get to know a lot of different areas of law, a lot of different people, depending on how international the firm is that you're working at. So I think it's a very good area for international.
Yeah, that's really interesting that it can differ so much between jurisdictions.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I guess this kind of links as well, because that's kind of like a level of understanding sort of how things work in different parts of the world. But obviously we've spoken about the real diverse range of clients and work that you do, and a lot of it seems to be very technical, different financial services products and clients you'll be working with. So Oksana, what level of understanding do you need to have of the financial products that you're dealing with?
I think you need to have a deep understanding of your client's products and services to be able to advise them on them. You also need to have an understanding of the regulatory framework which those products are subject to, such as Consumer Credit Act, for example. And what's great about TLT is we have banking lawyers and financial regulatory lawyers who advise on the products themselves. So that gives the litigators in the firm a great bank of knowledge in relation to the product in the event of disputes. So we can always go and seek clarification or advise on the product before going back to our clients and advising them.
Great, thank you. When I was researching for this masterclass, I saw that a lot of lawyers in this area might actually have had some experience working at the Financial Conduct Authority or the Prudential Regulation Authority. So I wondered if and I think we've said that none of you have actually done that, but I thought it'd be interesting just to say to our viewers, how might that sort of experience help you understand your client's perspective? Samuel, this one's for you. And then also I heard you say that you've done some work at Goldman Sachs. So maybe you can also say what sort of working in different areas and maybe for the almost like for the clients you'd be working for, how that can help you in your role.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that we in our team have a few people who have been at the regulator either on secondment or we've got someone who worked there actually for a good few years, and that's very useful. I find it's very useful to talk to this one chap in particular who used to work there, just to sort of calibrate risk levels for clients sometimes, because there's a danger that we sit here researching the law and applying it without a sufficient sense of what the FCA or the PRA really care about. You can get some idea of that by looking at their enforcement statistics, because I think someone told me once that if you printed off the entire FCA rule book, it would be about 6 foot tall. There's a huge range of rules, but when you look at them, they actually only enforce a relatively small proportion of those, because there are particular areas that they care about, like exploitation of retail customers, unsurprisingly, borderline scams or actual scams, market abuse. So you sort of have that, but even with that's still just a sort of desktop statistic. What's helpful if you have one way or another some access to someone who's seen behind the curtain at the regulator, as it were, is just a sense of, well, okay, but even within those, how's it going to work? You know, if it's a relatively small value thing, I think the reality is that the regulators have long backloads. There are huge numbers of things that they could probe if they want to, even just at the supervision stage before they get to enforcement. So they have to prioritize. They've got their long caseload. So you have to think about that. Then you have to think about the fact that going from just general supervision to enforcement is a big deal. The FCA, for example, is putting its reputation on the line to some extent. They get a lot of flag if they invest a lot of time and money in an investigation, and then in the end, there's no real outcome. It gets dropped, or there's no conviction, or whatever it may be. So it's just really helpful to discuss those things, to just try and fine tune the advice, really. And in terms of my comment at Goldman Sachs, that was in their private wealth team, which means providing wealth management services to high net worth individuals. I think you need about £10 million to walk through the door to get advice or management from Goldman Sachs. At least that was a few years ago. It's probably gone up since then. And that was really good in itself, because it was very interesting to work in a bank, because frankly law firms are quite simple businesses in the sense that we might be different types of lawyers within the firm, but we're still just we're providing legal services. So we provide documents and emails, and we turn up to calls and meetings and sometimes court. Whereas within a bank, for instance, a bank is a technology company, as well as huge teams of people managing clients, but there are vast systems in place so they can actually trade shares, for instance, manage the funds that they offer. So there's all sorts going on. So it's really interesting just to see the sort of complexity behind the scenes. But it's also very useful. I'm conscious that we've got a few people on the call who sound as though they are in work already, so they might already have worked at financial services firms in some way. Of course, they're the recipients of our advice. So another danger for us is that we provide slightly abstract advice, which is, very detailed and maybe entirely correct, but it's not that easy to apply in the real world. Whereas if you go on secondment or one way or another you've been the recipient of advice, then your heart sinks if you get a 3-page memo from, or actually that's quite short for a memo, probably a 3-page email from some law firms, particularly in some jurisdictions, where there's barely even a conclusion, or maybe if you're lucky, there's one at the end which sort of indicates maybe what the answer is. But that's pretty hopeless. You realise that if you spend time with a recipient of advice, that really they want the answer in the first line, email, ideally, and a few bullet points, not a few pages of advice typically. effectively. So in all those ways, really, it's just very interesting and useful then for doing our job back in private practice.
Great. Yeah, it sounds like that would add really good context to the role. And I think when we come later talking about sort of advice for people getting work experience, that sort of thing, it sounds like working in a bank or getting any kind of experience in that kind of office could be really helpful as well. Great. I'm aware that we're whizzing through. I'm going to do a quick stop in our business development section before I go off to hot topics and future trends, because I can see a million questions coming in about all the things we've spoken about, and everyone's excited about ESG and AI and all those things. So, Rachel, just quickly for you, business development is a huge part of being a lawyer, and maybe you could summarize how you would go about getting new business for your team and your department.
Yeah, so I think I break this up broadly into two categories, the macro and the micro. So the macro is we've got existing clients at the firm that come to Macfarlane's because they've always used Macfarlane's, they like the way that we give advice. And then we also go through tendering processes, which is where essentially we put together a proposal for a client who's looking for advice alongside a panel of other law firms, and then they choose their preferred firm depending on this type of work, the cost, etc., etc. So that's one way of getting work for the team. The other way is just through your network. So I have found over my career, people that I trained with, people that I went to university with, have ended up in some of my clients and have ended up in the regulator and things like that. And they're a really good resource for me in terms of like knowledge and understanding what's going on in their businesses. But also, if I'm lucky enough, they may give me some work. So that's another stream. So that's more on the micro level. But we also do things through publications, speaking events, being on panels and things like that help raise the profile of not only our team, but also the firm.
Great. So I couldn't find the unmute button. I was about to say, yes, that sounds really interesting. And I love that networking, we always say, is such a valuable skill. And it sounds like people who are students now, keeping in touch with your peers is definitely could be really useful in the future. Great. Hot topics and future trends. It's the part that everyone always gets excited about. Maybe I can start with you, Saskia. I think we've identified a few sort of hot topics, but maybe if you could summarize anything else, what are people talking about in your practice area? Have there been any significant changes or developments sort of in the recent year or upcoming that you can think of?
Yeah, I think we've touched on a lot of the big ones, a major one being ESG and how that can impact the loans that you're getting or the assets that you're financing. I just came back from a secondment at Goldman Sachs, actually in the real estate sector, and there's a massive impact of ESG and the issue of greenwashing, and that can really permeate, and knowing about those areas can really help, and knowing sort of that it's going to become a problem for a client or something that they're actively thinking about can mean that you can think about it before and have advice on it before and sort of put that into the advice that you're giving. So I think ESG is definitely a big one. Interest rates, like Rachel said earlier, have a big impact on the amount of work that you're getting and the kind of risk that clients might want to take as well. The kind of and almost the sort of, it was very busy during COVID and then less busy. So kind of seeing that, how that impacted as well. Those are the two big things. I think in real estate generally, there's a lot of changes in terms of construction, which has been quite interesting, especially following the Grenfell tower. So that kind of the construction regulations that came in with that. So our construction team working on updates for the clients. So that can be internal memos. So you find out about the new laws and make sure that that can go into the documents and advice for clients, and also external memos to clients, which can be good in terms of just warning them of new laws that are coming, good from a business development perspective as well, like Rachel was saying. So I think those three are the big things that we're seeing in law, and also AI from a legal perspective and how that impacts the actual legal world as well is a big topic that people are talking about, both in law firms and in the clients as well.
Saskia, is it sort of your individual responsibility to keep up to date with all these things? Is it your teams? Does the firm provide you with information? Because things change so quickly. How do you keep up so that you can best advise your clients?
I think probably all of the above. I mean, it's always your responsibility, but there'll be people in the firm whose also responsibility is to sort of monitor these things. So you have people with lots of specialties in the firm who will then send through memos. So people who are specialised, for example, in construction or sustainability or regulations, who will send out, extra emails to everybody in the firm, but also things, especially in your practice area, for example, real estate, if something that's come up and there's a new law, it's definitely your responsibility, but obviously people in the team are doing the same similar work to you, so it'll be something that's discussed as well, especially if it has a direct impact on clients and the kind of legal drafting that you're doing.
Great, thank you. Oksana, did you want to chip in with anything else from that? Any other topics or things that are happening at TLT or in your team?
Well, I'd say there's loads happening in the financial market. Every day there's something new that you can find, and that greatly affects the clients. So the clients will come to us and, and they'll say, oh, I've seen this in the media, can you advise? Should I be worried? So there are currently a number of Court of Appeal decisions that are outstanding. So we all eagerly awaiting those judgments so we can advise our clients and the clients can prepare for the future. Interest rates, again, that's something that we need to keep on top of and keep advising our clients.
I mean, yeah, I think that what one of the reasons that I suspect we all quite like this area is that to some extent just what sort of happens in just trends in the real world become things that affect financial services firms. I mean, when I started doing this about 11 years ago, the idea that ESG or AI or things like diversity and inclusion would be things that would fall within the remit of a financial services lawyer would never have occurred to me. I don't think it would ever have occurred to any of us, but because those have become big things, investors take an interest in them, therefore financial services firms take an interest in them, the regulator takes an interest in them. So even if there were no changes in any rules, if we had some sort of moratorium for a few years, there'd still be loads for us to get to grips with because there's so much of it. But it's not like that. It's always changing, which is interesting, and it's also quite important in terms of how we make our money as businesses, because a lot of what clients need help with is change. There are areas of rules which have been there for a while, and conventions evolve. People tend to know what they're doing, whereas an EU act on artificial intelligence, for example, has never been one of those before. So clients have to work out what to do, and therefore they need the help of lawyers.
Is it fair to say that this area is sort of even more highly regulated than perhaps other legal areas? And, does that mean that there are specific challenges? What are the regulatory challenges? I think we've spoken about this before, but that are currently facing the profession. I don't know, Sam, if you want to stick with that.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, very, very much so. Very, very highly regulated sector, and it only ever seems to go one way, really. Occasionally, there are these bouts of supposed simplification from the regulator, but in my experience, whenever I see that, it just tends to be like, okay, fine, well, there'll be more complexity then. I mean, if you take Brexit, for example, it's a whole big complex subject in itself, but one of the obvious effects of that is that whereas in the UK, when we were part of the EU, we had not complete, but we had a lot of harmonisation. Post Brexit, we basically took all existing EU rules, put them on our regulatory books, and then over time the regulator is starting to fiddle around with those, repeal some, make some changes. Meanwhile, the EU is continuing to develop its own regulations. Further iterations come out of those rules, and sometimes we might adopt those, but we don't have to anymore. And so that's just more complexity, more regulation, because what clients often, or what firms often want, is a sort of lowest common denominator approach. The issue isn't necessarily, oh, we have to comply with these rules. It's more, well, are those rules sufficiently certain? Have we got used to those? And can we apply those across our London, Luxembourg, Paris, maybe even New York offices, or not? And so actually, the more sort of if the UK start as it is, if the UK further diverges from the EU, that makes that sort of common denominator approach a bit harder. Sometimes, even if paradoxically, even if we might simplify things a bit, if the client just wants a consistent approach, that's actually not necessarily that helpful to them.
Thank you. That's great. I think this will lead in as well, because I want to talk about the sort of skills that you need to succeed. And it sounds like breaking down complex issues to be able to explain it, as we said earlier, is a really important one. Before we move on, just wanted to, I was just doing some research, and this morning there was an article in City AM about how the financial services sector is leaning into AI. Banks are spending, with banks spending on generative AI alone, estimated to hit 85 billion globally in 2030. It's currently 6 billion this year, and it's forecasted that AI could add up to $340 billion, this is all dollars, in value to the global banking industry each year. So maybe, I think Rachel and Saskia, you were keen to talk about this, but how do you think AI and technology will impact financial services now and in the future as well?
I might just, before we talk about the industry as a whole, I might just talk about how it's affecting law firms, and using my firm as an example. So we have partnered with a generative AI tool called Harvey. I think hopefully some of you may have heard of it, but we now use that as a firm to support lawyers and support staff in delivering work in a more efficient and cost-effective way. It's not a replacement to lawyers. That's a question that I often get asked, is, are you going to get replaced by AI? I don't think so. I hope not. But it's definitely a really incredible support tool for us. So we might use it, for example, when we are analysing and interpreting a contract, and we want to just have a quick view on what the termination provision is, for example, and that will identify the termination provision, summarize it. Now, as a good lawyer, you always have to check that it's right, and sometimes it doesn't always get it right. But we also use Harvey for content creation. So if we need to create a presentation for a client, or we want to put out some comms on a particular matter, it's also quite good at doing a first cut of those. So as a law firm, it is changing the way that we do our jobs. It certainly isn't replacing us, because I don't think there is a substitute for years of experience in the market. The experience that you get from having looked at lots of different issues, worked with lots of different clients. It doesn't have that edge, but it certainly does support us and give us the time and space to focus on doing the really nitty-gritty, difficult stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you want to say anything? Oh, sorry, Saskia, go ahead.
I was just going to say I'd agree with that. I think we use it for the big tasks, in terms of if you would used to have 100 documents coming in, checking if this one clause is in one of these documents, or making sure if that's effective, you would normally have had to go through every single document and check that. And obviously you have a human error in that sometimes. So the Harvey tool can be quite good for that kind of thing. And then obviously, as Rachel says, checking it, because sometimes these things can hallucinate, similar to ChatGPT. So it's just making sure. But it is quite interesting to be at the sort of what feels like the outset of a changing environment in the legal space, and just seeing how that's going to impact law firms. And also clients are using this a lot more now, not Harvey, but different kinds of AI tools, and trying to include that in their businesses. So being at the forefront of that is quite interesting, and seeing how it's going to impact different kinds of law firms and different kind of work that we do.
We also have clients who, when we are pitching for work, we will offer a solution that incorporates Harvey or any type of generative AI, depending on the law firm that you're at. And so we see that when we've got, to Saskia's point, lots of documents to review, we can make a more competitive bid for the work if we use an AI tool that is able to do some of the lower risk, less complicated document review work. And like I said, that frees up time for the lawyers, who are more expensive, to do the hard analysis and to do the tricky stuff. So it is often a feature of a lot of the work that we're doing now with our clients.
Great, thank you. We're running out of time, and I feel like we could do a whole separate masterclass about AI, and we have done, and we've got another one coming up next in February about innovation and the future of law. So we'll save that for now. And I'm sure, just so everyone knows, in pretty much every practice area masterclass we're doing, we'll be asking the lawyers about AI, so you'll get lots of different insights from different areas, which I think will be useful. Just quickly for a couple of minutes, just want to talk about key skills, sort of how students can get into this practice. Oksana, we spoke about, is there a typical career path for getting into this area? And then I know you actually qualified into a different area. So maybe you could say what maybe the typical path might be, and then or how you did it as well.
Yes, so the traditional route is you will do your training contract, you will do your 4 seats, and then you will qualify into your favourite seat. So financial services, if you do a seat there, then you'll automatically qualify into that area. But they are different routes. So I actually qualified into insurance, and I practiced insurance for a number of years, and then decided to cross-qualify into financial services. And what made me decide to move, well, I just wanted to try something new, I guess. And the financial services market is UK is the largest financial sector behind the US. There's been quite a lot of developments in the financial crime, consumer duty. So when I was picking the area, that for me, that stood out, and I feel I made the right decision. And hopefully I'll continue to feel that until the end of my career. But so far, so good. But yeah, loads of different routes, and you could. I mean, we have people coming from financial sector themselves and then deciding that they want to become lawyers and qualifying that way.
I think your story is a great testament to keeping an open mind. And I think people do worry about qualifying into an area and maybe changing your mind, but it can happen to great success. So that's great to see. I'm going to whiz around and ask Rachel, Saskia, and Samuel, could you give like one piece of advice about entering this area? It could be a skill or something you think they might need to know. Samuel, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it's something that's really helpful to bear in mind is that I think in a law firm, my views might be controversial. There are sort of three, really, there are all these departments, but really there are 3 types of practice area. There's transactional, advisory, and contentious. And I think personally, the great thing about advisory is that it's in between the two. You need the sort of kind of cerebral aspect of litigation. You need to be able to do the sustained analysis on the one hand, but on the other hand, if you're acting for banks, these sorts of fundamentally things have got to be done. They've got to be done quickly. So if you can bring those to move it from a sort of description to a piece of advice, if you can combine the sort of attention to detail that you really need as a litigator with the ability to just get stuff done commercially effectively, which is what you have to do as a transactional lawyer, then you'll be a good advisory lawyer. It's my view.
That's a great summary. Thank you. Saskia, any advice or key skills from you?
That was really good advice. I think just generally on the financial side and transactional side as well, and the advisory, it's that really annoying commercial awareness. I think being aware of what clients are bothered about. I think when I was on secondment, that became really clear for me in terms of the kind of things that they're working on, actually trying to understand what they're actually doing and how that impacts your advice that you're giving. And then also the point previously that Samuel made about the kind of advice that you're giving and the style that you're giving it in, and being quick to respond. Those kind of things are really, really important. Maybe is just as important as the actual law that you're doing. So I think understanding that and having an interest in it obviously helps. So just keeping up to date with those things is really important.
Great, thank you. And Rachel?
So I'm going to give some slightly different advice, actually. I think a piece of advice that was applied to me throughout my whole career when I was looking to start my career in law, and that I think probably just applies throughout, and it doesn't matter what type of lawyer you end up being, but my piece of advice would be to leave your ego at the door. This is a really complicated but rewarding career. And you will inevitably face setbacks, whether that is getting into the career to start off with. I personally had a bit of a squiggly line to getting my training contract. And then when you get there, you know, you start out as a trainee, you don't know anything, and you're around all of these incredibly bright people who appear to know absolutely everything. But what I've learned over the last few years is that this is a vocation. You learn on the job, and the more that you keep an open mind, the more that you are receptive to learning from your setbacks, ultimately the better lawyer you'll become. And I think that, you know, we've got a range of levels of lawyers on this call, but I think everybody would say that regularly they are humbled by this job. They are in a situation where they don't know the answer to something, or, you know, and you just have to be resilient and keep going, and use all of those setbacks as opportunities to learn and move forward.
Thank you. That's really great advice from all of you. I'm aware we're very quickly running out of time, and I have asked you all to prepare a case study, which we're going to have to whiz through. But we always like to sort of give our audience sort of a real life snippet into the sort of work they might be doing. So we've asked our panelists today to prepare a short summary of basically a recent interesting case, or maybe an example of a typical case. Is anybody super keen to go first or to go at all? Please do let us know, otherwise I'll pick someone.
I'm happy to go.
Great, thank you.
I said I'd come back to the debanking. As I don't know how many of you've read about that, and I don't know whether Nigel Farage is focusing on other things now that he's an MP, but he was certainly very exercised by Coutts's attempt to close his accounts in summer last year. And the FCA very quickly got involved because he kicked up quite a storm, and so the FCA said to Coutts, "Look, you've got to commission a law firm to do an independent investigation into what went on." And so Coutts, which is part of NatWest, came to us. And we ended up doing 3 reports. The first was into the decision on the debanking or attempted debanking, because actually didn't close his accounts in the end. The second was on the dinner that some of you might possibly remember that Alison Rose, then CEO of NatWest, attended with the BBC, which she was a bit more candid about the case than she should have been, and ultimately she lost her job. And then thirdly, report into wider debanking within Coutts, because it wasn't just Nigel Farage whose account was NatWest was trying to close. And so we had to do this investigation in, or at least the first 2 reports, we had to do them within 8 weeks, which is a really tight time frame. We had to interview about 40 people and review about 6 million documents, I think it was. And I think it probably just it illustrates some of the things that we've been talking about on the call, in that on that we had to put on it disputes people. They're experts in reviewing millions of documents, thank goodness. Advisory lawyers like me, data protection, which you might not have thought of, but proved to be a bit of a sting in the tail, really, and also employment law, because of course the key thing that Nigel Farage was alleging was that he'd been debanked because of his political views. And so there was a question, well, was that sort of discrimination that engages in the Equality Act? So we had to bring those people together. We had to do it quickly. And then we published these reports, and the summaries of them are publicly available. Hence how I can talk about this. But that was just something. I think it's the only thing I've ever worked on which actually made the front page of the FT. So it was, it was really a live thing in society at the time, and it still goes on in some shape or form. Actually, the FCA published another paper on debanking yesterday, in which, by the way, they've still found that there's not much evidence of people's accounts being closed because of their political views. So that was, in some senses, that was a one-off job. There's not going to be another sort of debanking massive investigation like that, I suspect. But there'll be something else which is equally interesting, and will call on the sorts of skills that financial services lawyers need to have.
Thank you. I think a few people's ears pricked up when you mentioned that earlier, because lots of people were going, "Can you tell us more about it?" So I'm in the questions. So that's great. Thank you. Saskia, did you have a short case study or example you wanted to give?
Yeah, a few examples of recent real estate financings that we've done. So we've recently advised a fund in its acquisition of some student accommodation in Wembley Park. There's a big student accommodation site there. So we represented a fund for the construction of this asset. So at the minute they were just buying land, and so it's a different kind of financing because there's a lot more risk, and we were advising the borrower because obviously if you're actually building these student accommodations, I think it's going to be about 800 beds and about 7,000 square feet, so it's quite a big one. But if something goes wrong during the construction, then the asset isn't actually built and the lender doesn't have anything to actually enforce on. So you've got a lot more. That's why the financing was a lot more interesting in terms of the risk that you've got to take and think about when you're drafting it. So we helped them in connection with that, and that also included a green loan facility for the development of that asset. So it's sort of shows you how the ESG part of it goes into the loans that you're dealing with, and the building contract entered into. So that meant we dealt with the corporate team as well as the construction guys as well. And there was also an international element to that because the borrowers were in different jurisdictions. So whilst the assets in the UK and obviously quite close by, there was I think we worked with lots of different firms actually on that one. So that was an interesting one. Another one we did recently was advising on the development loan to finance a film and television production facility in the outskirts of London. So again, that was quite interesting because it's a different kind of asset. And you had to think about the kind of issues that the developer wanted to think about. So for example, how long the leases had to be, because if they get a tenant in who's doing only one season and it goes wrong, you have to get them out. So things like that were very interesting in terms of putting that into the loan, which you might not think about in a sort of student accommodation or logistics assets. So that one I think was about £250 million loans. It's quite a big one. So those two recent cases that we've worked on.
Thank you. And I think it's interesting that you've pulled on lots of the threads we've mentioned today already, which shows how sort of everything comes together in real life when you're actually working on a case. Rachel and Oksana, I hope you're not offended, but I might just go to some questions because we've only got 3 minutes and I'm aware, and we actually have answered lots of these questions as we've gone through, which is fantastic. Okay, here's a good question. Someone says, do you have any advice for law students without much experience in the financial sphere about how they can build their foundational knowledge on financial services, particularly learning more about the types of products or clients that you deal with? Oksana, I feel like you sort of answered this question a little bit earlier about how much you need to know, but do you have any advice for students on how they can start building knowledge at an early stage?
I would say loads of bedtime reading. Read up on any developments on the markets, any sort of future developments that are about to happen. And that's what I did. I did loads of reading, loads of research to decide the area that I wanted to cross-qualify in. And that's what interested me the most. And luckily, it worked out for me. So, yeah, that's my advice. And gain work experience as much as you can with different financial institutions, not just law firms, but also lenders.
Probably worth saying that as a student, if you're going to apply for these firms, it's not like you're going to need to be an expert. It's just that awareness, isn't it? We've spoken about lots of issues today. If any of them are interesting, go and research and think about how it might impact the firm, how it might impact clients, the sector. Is that kind of a way of thinking that can really help you. Which is great. Okay. Someone's asked, which I guess I didn't actually ask. Maybe Rachel, you can answer this. What was your motivation for pursuing this area of the law?
Good question. I like this area of law, one, because my practice is predominantly advisory. So I like, getting interesting questions in from clients, picking up the phone to clients, talking to them. I also like writing. So the type of work that we do lots of advice notes. I think Samuel might have mentioned that earlier. So it was not just the type of work, but I like the people that I work with. Advisory law is a particular breed of person, I think, broadly, very conscientious, detail-oriented, team players. So and I just found the work really interesting. No 2 days are the same. And like I said, you have such a broad diet of work. Your career will take you to places that you never thought that it would. And I love that about this job.
Great, thank you. Apologies that we don't have time to do any more questions, but I'm looking through them. We have actually answered lots of them already, which is great. So what we will do now is we'll just finish up. So thank you so much. And what I'm going to do is just share my final poll so that we can see what everyone's key takeaway was from the day. So I'll just give you 30 seconds or so to answer that. But in the meantime, I just wanted to say a big thank you to our panelists because it's been super, super interesting. And I know that the audience have got a lot out of it. I can see the engagement from everyone. So we do hope you found this session informative and inspiring. Let us know what your key takeaway is. It's always great to sort of have a reflect on these events, think about what you're going to do next. What's your action plan? Is it to do some more research, try and get some work experience? Are you going to apply to any of the firms here today? Let me just give you a few more seconds. And I shall just share. Oh, that's great news. So the majority of people actually said that they now know more about what the work of this of a solicitor in this area involves, which is really the point of this. And a lot of you said you also know the key issues facing, which is great. And apologies, we do not have time to go through all of them, but there was lots of great summaries and takeaways, I think, from what we spoke about today. So thank you very much for that. And before you all go, just another reminder to attendees that we're going to be sending out a link with the recording and the follow-up email tomorrow. There'll also be a survey popping up. If you could just fill that in and when you've closed down the webinar, then we'll be able to see how you've enjoyed today and what other topics you'd like us to cover in the future. I mentioned that City AM article earlier, and lots of people have said, can you send me the link? So I'll make sure that goes in the follow-up email too. So once again, thank you very much to all of our panelists and to everyone attending today. We look forward to seeing you next time. And do remember that all our masterclasses can be found on our events page, which will be linked in that follow-up email as well. So we hope you all have a good afternoon. Thank you to the panelists again.